Welcome to the Bordeaux Show, an ongoing exploration of the famed region and its wines. I'm Ron Edwards, Master Sommelier and Director of Wine Education here at Winebow, and I'm riding shotgun on TJ's journey through Bordeaux. We invite you to place any questions or comments in the Q&A, as we will not be managing the chat window. So if you raise your hand or anything like that, we're really not going to be attending to that. So put anything that you need in the Q&A. Let me introduce your host once again, certified Bordeaux educator, TJ Griffin. TJ has held many jobs within the wine industry, from hospitality to wholesale. Throughout his career, what he enjoyed most was learning about wine and sharing that knowledge with others. As the corporate wine educator for Winebow, he now enjoys the privilege of doing what he loves full time. And now here to discuss today's topic, grape varieties of Bordeaux, TJ Griffin. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Ron. How are you?
I am well. It's sunny here in Richmond, and it looks like it's trying to warm up, although the thermometer suggests otherwise. So we're, warming up, I suppose, is relative to where you are. We're going to be in the high 40s, which would be lovely if I was still in northern Michigan, which I'm not.
Yes, it's now March, and March came in like a lion yesterday here in the Northeast. Very windy. No damage in my area, but I heard some people are without power in other places. So hopefully, well, if you're on this webinar, you have power, right? So
one would think, or at least you have a well-charged phone.
So, are you ready for grapes?
I am. I'm always ready for grapes.
We're going to tackle all of the grapes. I mean, this could be a multi-episode topic, but we don't have that kind of time, and nor do our attendees. So we're going to keep it to one episode, hopefully, here. So I'd like to start off with something new. Oh, there we go. So we're going to ask a poll question here, see if I can get this right. Launch poll. So I believe this is anonymous, so don't worry about that. Just take a guess and answer this question if you can. How many different grape varieties are authorized for Bordeaux AOC AOP in 2021?
Yep. So that's everybody. Put your answers in real quick, and we'll hit that poll here in just a second. TJ, does the next slide answer the question, or can we talk while they're answering questions?
The next slide does not answer the question, so we can talk.
Yeah. So that'll give them some time to answer, and I'll give you poll results or we can discuss them in a moment.
All right, so let's go back in time for a bit, and I want to start off, Ron. I don't know if you've encountered these people in your career that like to romanticize the past, and there's a lot of that with wine, right? Especially with Bordeaux, they're nostalgic for the Bordeaux of their youth and their halcyon days. It was different, it was better, it was this, it was didn't have this grape, had more of this grape. And the truth is, Bordeaux has always been changing. It's been constant movement since it started. And, maybe not in one's lifetime do you see drastic changes, although maybe you do, but certainly over the course of decades, Bordeaux changes constantly. And if you look at some records, in 1784 in the Libournais, which is the right bank, there were 34 red grape varieties and 29 white grape varieties recorded. In the Médoc, not as many. There were 9 red and 4 white, but the Médoc was a younger region, as you know. Now, this is a book that is still in production, I believe, or I think we're in the 12th edition or something like that. So this is a book that's been since the early 19th century, Bordeaux et Sévin. And here's some grapes that were listed in the book in 1874, and you tell me if you recognize any. Do you recognize that one, right?
Oh, yeah, of course, Syrah. No, I have no idea what that is.
A little different spelling, but yes.
Syrah.
Syrah, which sounds like a Monty Python sketch.
Mm-hmm.
Full Blanche, you familiar with that one?
We know that one. That's Vermentino.
Yeah. Mustouzer.
The mustache grape. Nice.
The mustache grape, yes.
Must have had really fuzzy tannins.
Full Blanche is actually a grape that you see in South, I think, Roll is Vermentino.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I
Yes.
misspoke. Yes, you're right.
Full Blanche is, it was more popular. It's apparently one of Jancis Robinson's books, they referred to it as Muscadet's country cousin, very high acid. Was more prominent in the base wines for Armagnac and Cognac, but is falling out of favor. Moustouzer, I have no idea. It was just listed. I don't know what the grape is. I know it's a red grape, and maybe it looks like a mustache. I don't know. Nochon, another red grape that is thought to be the same as Jurançon Noir, which is also found in southwest France and is a natural cross between Full Blanche and Côte or Malbec, so that would make sense. And another one, Pardot, which is a red grape with extremely high acidity that is supposedly similar to Cabernet Sauvignon. So I could go on and on with these, but these are, some of the grapes that we know today that were allowed at the time, and some grapes that we've never heard of, that we don't even see anymore for the most part. So should we take a look at our poll, Ron?
Yes, I think so. I think that the answers are only going to show on your side, though.
Oh, okay. Well, then I will take a look at the poll. So we have a slim majority, 39%, went for 13. 30% went for 9. 17% voted for 6. And 13% voted for 19. So should we reveal the answer as a team?
I think we definitely should. Don't hold them in suspense for too long. They might leave.
So the actual answer is 19, and we'll explore why that is in a minute. But good for you if you got that one.
It's sort of like the tricky question of, there we go. How many grape varieties are authorized in Burgundy versus what's actually practically used, right? It's
exactly.
Different question.
But, I remember when I first learned the correct answer not too long ago would have been 13. And I remember finding that out. I'm like, 13? I didn't know that. And now we have 19. So. All right, let's get into red grapes. That is the most recent plantings in Bordeaux, and that's Bordeaux as a whole. So Bordeaux is about red wine, and in the red wine category, it's mostly Merlot. You have 66% Merlot, which I believe is exactly 2/3, or very close to. So I did some math, Ronnie. This is more your expertise, but I did some math. So 66% of 88%, I think, carry the one is 58%. So 58% of Bordeaux is Merlot. So, and if you look, these first 3 grapes, Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon, and Cabernet Franc, that's 98% of the plantings. So we always we don't always, but we frequently talk about the Bordeaux varieties. We talk about Malbec and Carmenere and Petit Verdot, but it's really these 3 grapes and really Merlot.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about Merlot. You like Merlot, Ron?
I do.
Does it get an unfair rap sometimes?
Absolutely, and I think it's because it's hiding in so many places that people don't realize they're drinking it very often, and
Exactly.
Loving it, and then having a bad attitude about it at another point in time.
So it's the most common grape in Bordeaux, as we just saw. It's it has a lot of great structure, but it's also at the same time very lush, very supple. It's a sensory. It's a grape for hedonists, really, when it's well done. It's sugar and alcohol levels tend to be higher than Cabernet Sauvignon, which can be an issue with climate change, as we'll talk about a little later. It likes cool, moist soil, so it's more at home on the right bank, but there's certainly plenty in the left bank as well. It ripens about 2 weeks earlier than Cab, but it's also susceptible to spring frost because it buds earlier as well. So, and its parentage. It's a cross between Cabernet Franc and an obscure grape called Magdeleine Noire de Charente, which it took them a while to figure that out, but they figured it out. And the name Merlot, we say Merlot, but it's properly pronounced Merlot, comes from its resemblance to the blue-black plumage of the blackbird, or merle in French.
There you go. Lots of little things to notice. And when you start describing this typical characteristics of Merlot, you start to understand why In some places, it's such a perfect blending grape. And in other places it's planted, it's perfectly happy to stand on its own, right? It just depends on climate, soil, and the viticulturalists and winemakers' intent.
Absolutely. So Cabernet Sauvignon is what I think most people think of first when they think of Bordeaux. And that's all right, because it's a very important grape, and is an important part of some of the greatest wines in the world, right? It's definitely the most important variety in the Médoc. It ripens late, so it needs a fairly dry autumn. It doesn't, it's risky if it starts to rain in the autumn. It's less susceptible to spring frost than Merlot, and it resists rot as well, pretty well. The berries tend to be small, so the skin to juice ratio is high, so ergo tannins. And that's, you know, what it provides to a wine, a blend, especially is that structure, those firm tannins, which also give aging potential to the wine.
Mm-hmm.
Typical flavors, I mean, there's so many you could list, but typically we're in the black fruit category: black currant, blackberry, black cherry. And this is another grape, like you just said, depending on where you are, it's a great blending partner, but it also, I've had several 100% Cabernet Sauvignon, which is trickier maybe in the past than it is now with everybody's viticultural and winemaking knowledge to pull off. Fully ripe, it can have that sort of green edge to it, that vegetal thing that you get from pyrazines.
Yeah, and even if it is fully ripe, it's still fairly linear,
Mm-hmm.
and hard nosed. You know, and it doesn't have the acid structure that something like Nebbiolo would have to offset that really upfront tannin. And Nebbiolo can stand on its own, even though it works as blends as well, because it has that refreshing high acid thing to wash away the tannin and get you ready for another assault, right? And Cabernet Sauvignon doesn't do that very well. It just leaves you with that prickly, drying feel without as much refreshment. And that's one of the reasons that its blending partners are such good friends, is they add that softening effect that gives you something else to concentrate on while the tannin's attacking you.
Mm-hmm. And I was taught, I forget by whom, but it was sort of received as common wisdom, that Cabernet Sauvignon was what they call a donut hole grape. It lacks mid palate, and that's where the Merlot comes in. It fleshes out the mid palate, and on its own, you know, Cabernet Sauvignon is hollow. So, one of our Australian winemakers from the Margaret River heard that and was appalled. She said, "Well, then you don't know how to make Cabernet Sauvignon."
No, we're just not making it in Margaret River.
Yes.
That's a very different place, right?
Exactly. So
Same,
maybe
you have to
have the right spot. You have to have the right terroir, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cabernet Franc. Talk about a complementary grape variety. I've had some 100% Cabernet Franc. I don't think from Bordeaux, but from California, and they're very nice. And of course, we see that in the Loire Valley as well. But in Bordeaux, it's a blending partner. It brings a lot of freshness. It brings a lot of perfume and aromatic complexity. It does have small berries similar to Cabernet, so you get those great polyphenols. Now, this is interesting, Ron, because where do we see it mostly in Bordeaux? We see it on the right bank, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially in Saint-Emilion. So it likes well-draining soil. So you're like, okay, well, why isn't it more prominent on the left bank? And the reason is because it's very susceptible to disease and rot. So it's not healthy on the left bank for Cabernet Franc, but on the right bank, it still wants those well-drained soils. So limestone, chalk, which is great for that. You don't see it as much on, say, sandy soils.
Makes sense. I mean, those are the soils it loves in the Loire Valley too, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you do have hillsides to help drain moisture and humidity off of vineyards on the right bank that you don't really have on the left. Everything's just sort of settles and there's nowhere for it to go but slightly downhill to the river. So it makes a lot of sense to me that this grape isn't very happy on the left bank.
All right, so here's our other red varieties, our supporting cast, which, as we saw earlier, is just 2% of the total planting. So Malbec, which is also referred to as Côte, which is also referred to as Prestac in Saint-Emilion, also known as Auxerrois. One thing that I've learned over the years about grapes is they are generally not short on synonyms,
No,
which can be
there's
quite confusing.
it's maddening.
Yes.
And nowhere is worse than Italy, but France is close.
So Malbec was a very, very important player back in the day, in the late 18th century and the early 19th century. And one estimate was that in the early 1800s, it was about 60% of the total Bordeaux vineyard.
Wow.
So a much bigger player in the Bordeaux world. And then phylloxera, which we'll talk about later on as we get into, well, we did talk about in the history, but we'll talk about as we go through different appellations and stuff and how it affected things. As we talked about, phylloxera was an opportunity to replant, to rethink. Our vineyard's done. We don't have a choice. So what do we want to do? And that's when a lot of grapes started to get phased out, mostly because they were susceptible to this or that issue. As one of my books says, we'd like to think that quality played a role as well, which I'm sure it did. But for Malbec, it was at the time, it was very susceptible to rot. And it is also, if it's picked too early, it can be quite vegetal. So it really needed good growing conditions to thrive. And that wasn't always the case in Bordeaux back in the day. So,
yes. I'm also told by our friends in Argentina that it doesn't really like to be grafted onto Native American rootstock as much as other vinifera vines, and that it's just easier to grow it on its own rootstock. Of course, that was in Argentina where they're growing it on their own rootstock. So maybe it's propaganda, but it was spoken to me by people who do their research. So we're going to take it as possible truth. And we'll wait and see if that really pans out later. But it makes a lot of sense if you had a hard time grafting it and it wasn't taking, that you would stop planting it and move on to something else.
Right. Yeah. So I never heard that, but we'll, like you said, we'll call that mostly credible.
Yep.
And it would totally make sense. You're trying to graft, you're trying to replant your vines now with the new rootstock, and you're trying to, that's a whole new variable for these, vignerons. They don't know which rootstock works with which, and like we do now. So if you start to have some bad results, you're like, forget this. Petit Verdot from the Pyrenees, primarily planted in the Médoc, now grown in Graves. Now, I saw some conflicting reports with Petit Verdot's popularity. Some people said it's chic and plantings are increasing, where others are completely phasing it out. So the truth is somewhere in the middle.
And increasing means what? Yeah, we have an extra 0.5 hectare planted over the last 5 years, right? So increasing is a relative term to begin with.
I've also had from California a 100% Petit Verdot, and it's good. It's, to me, it lacks a little bit of the structure of the others, although it's definitely not short and tans, but it's so deep. You swallowed whole there with that one.
I had a couple of examples from 100% from Australia too, and it was a similar experience. It's another one of those grapes that you don't want to accidentally spill that glass on your clothes because it's never coming out, but it was extremely velvety and very black currant juice. And, it was a little, I wouldn't say monolithic, but it wasn't like a lot of different flavors, but it was good. I just was like, okay, at least I now know what this flavor is supposed to be like, more or less, because you don't taste it by itself very often.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that comment. Maybe monolithic is too strong, but I know what you mean. It's Petit Verdot, and there's nothing petite about it.
No, it should be called aggressive Verdot.
So it was used to add color, add tannic depth, also add perfume. It's a lot of violets you get with Petit Verdot. Is it coming back? I don't know. This quote made me laugh when I was reading it. One producer said, because people say, well, in good vintages it can be very good. So he said, in good vintages you don't need it, and in poor vintages you don't want it. It just doesn't ripen at all. So that's sort of a damning sentence for Petit Verdot. Carmenere, originally from Bordeaux. The lost grape of Bordeaux is the trying to market in Chile. It's a cross between Cabernet Franc and Gros Cabernet. Slight, I think for me, out of the Bordeaux varieties, this is the grape that shows that pyrazine profile the strongest. Even when it's fully ripe, you still get that really green, which I don't mind. I like it, but can be off-putting to some.
Yeah, at its best, it gets fully ripe, and it's more of a roasted red pepper aroma and flavor profile than that fresh cut green bell pepper. But when it's not ripe, it's like somebody put asparagus in your red wine. So it's definitely, I see why they had trouble with it in the past and abandoned it, because you cannot predict full ripeness for a long hanging grape in Bordeaux most years. So
yeah, so it's great when fully ripe, but tough to get ripe, susceptible to coulure and oidium. So again, if you're replanting your vineyard, you're like, this grape's too much trouble. Again, making a comeback, Ron. That's what I hear. But as of right now, that is 4 hectares.
Yes,
in all of Bordeaux. So
as opposed to complete extinction, so they've got a small display at a zoo, basically.
Look at the Carmenere, and it's in the wild.
Yes, there you go.
So here's some white grapes. So a little bit different spread here. We have 2 grapes that are sort of neck and neck for most planted. And white grapes, as we said, the reds are 88%. So quick math, carry the 1, 12% of the total plantings are white grapes. And these 2 first grapes are 92%. So Seminole and Sauvignon Blanc. But don't forget about Muscadel. And then we have other varieties. This is where it gets tricky when you say how many grapes are authorized, because there's several white grapes that most people are not aware of. So first we have to talk about Seminole, the main grape variety for the sweet wines and more of a supporting role in the dry blends. It has body. It has that, where you see it in Australia and Hunter Valley, very unique characteristics that are unlike any other grape, where it starts to develop almost like an oak flavor with no oak at all, and that complexity. Very high acid in youth. But as it mellows, it really takes on a whole new persona with age.
Yeah, I think the picture of this cluster really speaks to the flavor profile for me. It's like seeing these grapes still hanging there. I feel like that's what the wine tastes like. Has that those richer golden fruit tones, and then you see the green grapes hiding behind, because it always has that sort of racy backbone to a certain degree. Maybe not as high acid as cool climate Riesling when it's ripe, like Bordeaux gets it ripe, but certainly equaling the acidity of Sauvignon Blanc, and but with a completely different texture.
Yeah, it's a texture thing, definitely, and that's where I pick it up. If you're tasting, for me, if I'm trying to blind taste, and you get that Sauvignon Blanc note, and you're like, oh, wait a second, there's something else going on here texturally. And I think it's even more apparent, probably because of how it develops complexity when you have it in one of the botrytis affected wines. You can really tell when there's a higher percentage of Semillon versus Sauvignon Blanc. Apricot, honey aromas. I struggle to identify when it does have botrytis, which what is the flavor of the grapes and what is the flavor of the botrytis itself, because there's a whole thing going on there. So, but
those are difficult to separate, because there's a definite overriding influence of that honey, saffron, dried fruit character, right? It's sort of like, I make it very similar to, like, if you air dry grapes or Strovine or any of the other, Pasito styles of the world, it's very difficult to talk grape variety after that, because you get the taste of raisins, right? And so botrytis affected wines are very similar to that. I really think the character of Semillon is much easier and more realistic to define as a dry wine than once you put that sort of overlay on it. It's sort of like, it's very much akin to me as like the flavor of a grape without oak and a flavor of a grape with oak. We often define the flavor of Chardonnay by definition of the oak influence on it, more so than the actual flavor of the grape, because it's so common to have the oak influence on top of it.
So when I talk about parentage in these slides, again, I'm going to recommend another book. I feel like maybe I should provide a bibliography for everybody. So every episode I mention one or two books. But one of my favorites, Wine Grapes by Jancis Robinson and Dr. Jose Villamos, who's an amplographer, and I believe is Julia Harding. Yes, I cannot forget Julia Harding, who's also a master of wine. It's the go-to reference for me. They've done a lot of studies. They've done studies by DNA analysis, but also by linguistic roots and history and when was it first mentioned and doesn't, so they put a lot of thought into it. And there's always competing theories. And I'm not saying this is 100% right because I don't know. But at some point you have to go with the reference, and this is my reference, and it's called Wine Grapes, and you should go get it.
I consider it an essential reference to all serious wine professionals.
And it's not inexpensive, so maybe ask for your birthday or Christmas.
Or you could have the one like I have is the original Jancis Robinson Vines, Grapes, and Wines, and you can really enjoy reading what was thought about all this stuff in 1995 as opposed to 2021.
Yeah, well, DNA analysis has changed everything, right? Oh, I should say for Semillon, regarding parentage, that was my point of bringing that up, is this is one grape, because it's a major grape, that they really are kind of unsure of. What they do know is it is a very, very closely related genetically to Sauvignon Blanc. Not a parent-offspring relationship, but very closely related. So Sauvignon Blanc, very, very important grape in the white Bordeaux wines. Again, when we're in dry whites, we're generally a much higher percentage of Sauvignon Blanc. When we get into the botrytis-affected sweet wines, much higher percentage of Semillon. So the ratio changes, but they are very complementary. Great acidity, great character, great citrus flavors. Has that very strong pyrazine note often, because it is one of the Bordeaux varieties. Boxwood is a great descriptor, but you have to know what boxwood is to get that, and that's tough. Fig leaves, somebody wrote. I don't know about fig leaves. I have to go get some fig leaves.
Yeah, I don't smell fig leaves very often, but lemongrass comes to mind, and you can approximate it by various intensities of green bell pepper, sliced, unsliced, just the skin without slicing it, stuff like that, to get a general idea. The point is, it's a little green herbal to a lot green herbal, depending on how late they harvest it and how much Semillon is in the blend, right? It's going to be less herbal, less green with more Semillon. My favorite ratio, depending on the weight of the wine and whether it spends time in oak, is that range between 20 and 40% Semillon. That's what really rings the bell for me out of Bordeaux blends.
So Sauvignon Blanc is originally from the Loire area, and then I believe it was on vacation in the Bordeaux area and met Cabernet Franc, and being in France, they fell in love and they produced Cabernet Sauvignon, which is such a big, powerful grape, more so than either of his parents. It's very interesting that genetically that happened.
Well, isn't that the goal of all parents, to have offspring that are even better than themselves?
True. So they were aspirational.
Aspirational, that's right.
Muscadel, people forget about sometimes. We saw 5%. And it also sort of like, I don't know, this bad rap might be too strong, but it's looked upon as maybe not as great a grape, but not a serious grape. But it's a very good grape. It's very complementary to the first two. It provides a lot of aromatic complexity. Its name is derived from muscat because of some of the similarities, the floral grapiness, but it's not related at all to muscat genetically. In fact, it is one of the offsprings of a grape called Gouais Blanc, which is like sort of the grape with many, many children, including Pinot Noir. So it's in that huge family of grapes. So here are the grapes that we often don't think about as being in Bordeaux, and they're not. They're very minor players, but they are still around. So Merlot Blanc, a cross between Merlot and Fol Blanche, which we talked about earlier. Sauvignon Gris, which is just a color mutation of Sauvignon Blanc, but we say that color mutations of grapes, but they become very different grapes in and of themselves. So different flavors. You get a little more floral aspect to the Sauvignon Gris, a little more of that muscatiness, that floral grapiness.
Mm-hmm.
Ugni Blanc we know pretty well. Trebbiano in parts of Italy. Not Trebbiano di Suave, but Trebbiano Toscano.
Toscana, yeah.
Toscano. Really more known in France as for the base wines of Armagnac and Cognac, but there is some in Bordeaux. And Colombard, which is another sort of a grape for mass production, generally used. But it does have some nice citral and floral aromas that contributes to the blend.
Yeah, and
So,
hitting on that Sauvignon Gris for a moment, this is the grape that accidentally ended up in Chile thinking it was Sauvignon Blanc. It tends to have more of a bitterness, a grip to it, almost like it has a more like a tannin, which makes sense from the pink skins, just like Pinot Gris, right? But it doesn't really carry that green pyrazinic effort much at all. And so when it's in the blend, it softens Sauvignon Blanc and adds sort of like muscle to the wine.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to talk about with the color mutation, because we hear about color mutations and you think, oh, so it's just a different color skin. No, it's a whole different thing. We would never say Pinot Gris is the same as Pinot Noir, even though Pinot Gris is just a color mutation of Pinot Noir. Very, very different grapes. But yes, Sauvignon Gris. I believe we have one of our Winebow imports has a significant for Bordeaux proportion of Sauvignon Gris, and it really pops.
Chateau de Fontenille Blanc.
Yes.
It's like 20%, and it's delicious.
Absolutely.
And if you're interested in what it tastes like, there's a tasting note on the Winebow website under Tasty Expectations. I just put it up there like Friday.
Oh, cool. So this is fresh in your mind.
Indeed.
Do you feel like the Sauvignon Gris announces itself in that wine?
I think it really does, because there's so much of it there, it's hard to ignore. And so it's well worth finding a bottle. It's also very affordable. It's under $20 retail. So it's a good exploration of what it's like if almost the panoply of Bordeaux white varietals get involved. There's not Ugni Blanc, Colombard, but the others that we've mentioned are all there. Sauvignon Blanc, Semillon, Sauvignon Gris, and Muscadel are all in that wine.
I just checked off panoply on my bingo card of words.
Yeah, it's still probably the biggest word I'll use all day. I'm really not a multi-syllabic kind of guy.
It's a great word, and I know exactly what you mean. So let's count our grapes so far. So we had 6 reds, then the 3 whites, and then 4 more whites. So 6 carry the 1, do a little math. I think we're up to 13. So where do we get the 19 from? Well, we have an update. So if you've been following the news, Bordeaux, in keeping with its ever-changing nature and in keeping with the threats of climate change, especially on the right bank, you get Merlot is getting very, very ripe. Regularly I see Saint-Emilion wines 15.5% alcohol, and they don't really have much choice because they're not going to be phenolically ripe until they get to that point. So it's not that they're necessarily doing that for a style, although sometimes they are. But as the whites get, as climate gets riper or warmer for the white grapes, and they get riper, they start to lose a little bit of acidity too. So here's an update from Bordeaux, and you can look these up. And some of you voted, so you probably already know this. There were originally 7 grapes announced in 2019 that they were going to propose to join the previous 13 grapes. And then this year, they announced that 6 of them are actually going to be official. One of them was rejected, and I'll talk about that in a second. But some of them, for the reds, I think you've heard of Touriga Nacional, Ron. you know that grape pretty well.
Yeah, I love that grape. So I was like, yeah, that makes sense. If the climate is going to get warmer, it would actually sort of, considering how it stays pretty balanced in Doru at this point, why not, right?
Yeah, it handles heat pretty well, and still has some nice complexity and some great flavors. So that should be interesting. There's a grape called Arinarnoa, which is a cross of Tannat and Cabernet Sauvignon. According to sources, it can be powerful, but has a tendency to be a little green. So
Yeah, and we think Gruner Veltliner is not selling because of the name. Come on. They're really going to have to work on that one for marketing purposes.
I've never seen a varietal Arinarnoa. I'm probably mispronouncing it too. One of the grapes is somewhat obscure, but people have heard of it, I'm sure. Marselan. Marselan is one of the grapes that was.
That one was one I was like, oh yeah, that's Rhone though, isn't it? And then I read the description, like, oh, okay.
It's a cross between Cabernet Sauvignon and Grenache, and apparently it's doing well in China, in the Ningxia region, which is producing Bordeaux-esque wines. I haven't had them, but apparently Marselan is doing well there. This next one, I'm going to butcher the name, but it's hard to find out the pronunciation for this. I want to say it's Castets. It's Castets. Could be Caste, but I'm going to say it's Castets because sometimes you pronounce that. Apparently, it's an old grape that was fairly widely planted in the Gironde area. They're bringing it back. I don't know anything about it, but we'll see. They like it for some reason. Now, some of these grapes were planted in experimental vineyards starting, I believe, in 2019 or even earlier. So they have had some experience with them. For whites, we have Alvarinho, which I think we all know as Alvarinho in Portugal. It's probably not pronounced Alvarinho. It's probably pronounced Alvarinho in Bordeaux. But I always say Alvarinho because I'm thinking of the Portuguese, also known as Albarino in Rias Baixas in Galicia. Makes sense to me. Great acidity, great aromatic potential.
And it doesn't have a problem with moist, humid air either.
Yes, exactly. Because that's what we have up there in that area. This is another one I'm gonna butcher. Liliorilla. Another one that doesn't quite catch on, Ron. Maybe needs a little thinking.
No, that one's definitely going to need some help from a major marketing company.
This is a cross between Baroque and Chardonnay. And someone wrote, perhaps the least known of all the suggested varieties, reportedly low acidity when ripe, so it seems like a strange choice. Okay. Powerful aromatic wines. So one of the thoughts behind Alvarinho and Liliorilla is that even in warm conditions, it retains its aromatic quality, so that doesn't get baked out of them. So you want to have that aromatic quality. One of the grapes that I had heard had very good potential and was announced, but was not finally approved, is Petit Manseng. So Petit Manseng, if I'm not incorrect, Ron, down the Mid-Atlantic, sort of near you, is producing some pretty good wines that on its own is blended with Sauvignon Blanc. Although I haven't had.
There's some delicious Virginian-based Petit Manseng. I think it's our highest quality white varietal, even though we have a bigger reputation for Viognier. I think it's super well suited to this reality, right? Somewhat maritime climate to mountainous climate. Humidity is always a problem here. It works out really well, and it stays really tart even in the hot Virginia summer.
So I reached out to a colleague who works for a winery in the Mid-Atlantic and sort of is a Petit Manseng expert. And I said, why do you think it wasn't approved? And she gave me many reasons, but perhaps the most prominent, the reason it makes the most sense is it's a very intense personality. So it might outshine all the other grapes in the blend. So that makes sense to me. The way I've read about, I haven't had it. It sounds like it a little bit like Viognier with much more acidity. Is that?
Yeah, I guess it's time for you to search out a bottle of Giron Sans Sec.
Yes.
Because that's the blueprint that they'd be looking at for Bordeaux. And I don't find it to be terribly aromatic. I find it to be sort of, it has to me, it has a kinship to the structure of a Sirtico, where it's bold and it has the ability to be big shouldered, but it always stays tart and refreshing. One of the reasons it's so fabulous with making it into dessert wine, right? Because it keeps that acid backbone even when the botrytis sets in. In Virginia, the ones I've had, which is, I don't know, I've had somewhere between maybe 5 or 8 different producers. I've never would have said, hey, this is an aromatic variety, but it is powerful.
Yeah, it's that's what she was saying. It's not a shy grape. It's also a little wonky in its chemistry, and it's a bit of a prima donna to work with. So maybe they.
Yes. I've also had several here that it's always questionable whether it's not a very good winemaker or whether it's the grape, right? I've had several of the 7 or so examples I've had here had a problem with volatile acidity in an unpleasant way.
So that's the 6 new additions. So that brings us up to 19. There are some rules, which I should share real quick because, people are maybe gasping, saying, what are they going to do to my Bordeaux? But these grapes are all considered experimental for the next 10 years. They can only cover 5% of your vineyard plantings, and they can only contribute no more than 10% of a final blend. And the grapes can't be mentioned by name on the wine label. So that I don't know what that's going to mean. We're not going to know if we're having them, and it's only for Bordeaux, Bordeaux Superior, and Ultra de Mer, Bordeaux Blanc for whites. So you're not going to see it in Pauillac or Saint-Emilion or anything. So exciting times in Bordeaux. One more thing to mention, hybrid grapes, which apparently played a much bigger role in the middle of the 20th century and then were ripped up, are also making a comeback. They are not authorized to be called Bordeaux. But they are growing there and people are experimenting. So we may see in coming years those being approved as Bordeaux as well. Right now they're Vin de France. But.
All right. Well, they're a hedge on your bets, right? They're just more sturdy and hardy and easier to fight the elements of nature with. And at worst case scenario, you can send them off to be distilled or turned into just Vin de France or whatever. So
this could be a whole episode in and of itself, but I just want to hammer the point home that, Bordeaux is about blending. It's a blend of different grapes. It's not a blend of different vintages like we see in Champagne, but you have these regions in France that are they're all about blending. The Rhone, Champagne, Bordeaux, and you see that in other parts of the world too, where certain over time and tradition and what grapes were there, they're about blends rather than single varietal wines. So that's the case in Bordeaux for whites, for reds, for sweet wines, and not just different grape varieties, but different vineyards. When you're talking Bordeaux AOC, you can go anywhere in the entire appellation to get these grapes. So very much about blending, always was, always will be. And that is that.
Well, I'd like to add to that comment, what did all the regions that you've brought up that blend, there's usually some common factors in those blendings, right? The first one is which grape, right? So we already decided that, Cabernet Sauvignon, especially in this region of the world, needs a little help from other grapes to flesh out, to be more round. When you brought up Champagne, why blend there? Because you never know what's going to get killed by frost in this, so you blend for survival techniques. Other regions of the world blended to either originally bulk up volume, right? Like Chianti. Why were we blending white grapes? Well, we liked a lighter style of wine anyway, and we were making wine for survival skills, not for the 90-point scores that didn't exist at the time. And Bordeaux is both, right? These grapes don't always stand alone on their own beautifully. And we have the vagaries of climate, not sure which of your vineyards are going to suffer from one malady or another, and therefore make it difficult to make a consistent offering out of and this is a brand driven region, right? It's Chateau pick your name, and people have an expectation for that brand, as opposed to the Burgundian model where they have an expectation for the grape through the hands of the vintner. And it's just a very different mindset in Bordeaux, and it makes sense to blend there.
Yeah, I think it's a great comparison to other regions, and I think this is just an opinion, but I think it's about everything you mentioned, and also the viticultural knowledge at the time. If you think about the Douro and you think about Tuscany, it was very difficult to make 100% Sangiovese for a long time. Now we can in certain areas, and it can be lovely. And we can have varietal Touriga Nacional, we can have varietal Tempranillo, we can have varietal Cabernet, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Petit Verdot, even Carmenere. But at the time, that wasn't an option. And now the vineyards are, as we see in this image here, they're a mosaic. They're a mosaic of different grapes and different, different areas, different terroirs. And I remember not too long ago, I'd love to do some research sometime on why the Americans market demands to know what the grapes are. They're like, what is the grapes? What's the grapes? Because it gives us we think we're able to go, oh, okay, now I understand it. No, you still don't, because there's so much other things going on. But I remember asking that at Bordeaux producers, they didn't know the final blend in the wine. What they would tell you is, I can tell you what the vineyard's planted to, but I don't know the exact percentages in the final wine. Now that's a little more buttoned up. But yes, great points about the other regions in the world we're on.
All right. And so next episode, we are going to talk about the six families of Bordeaux wines. Yeah. So this is
something that I believe the school, called de Bordeaux, called du Vin de Bordeaux, came up with sort of a way to group the appellations to make it make sense. So we're going to go from the general to the specific. So next time we'll be talking about Bordeaux AOC, Bordeaux Supérieur, and we'll move on from there. And I found it a very logical way to approach the topic. So that's what I'm going to follow. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ron. Thank you for your help and your knowledge and your expertise. Thank you all for attending, and stay safe. And we hope to see you every Tuesday at 11 for Pre-Shift and the Bordeaux Show.